thought I'd make a video on the reading by David Hume of the academical or skeptical philosophy, just because I didn't put up any videos, I think, as we were going through the essay. I don't have a lot to say about it, except maybe point out some of the basics and give you some interpretation of what he's doing in this essay. Obviously, the subject is skepticism, and it's a very interesting assessment. I don't think that Hume would say he has anything original to say here about the basis of skepticism or the claims of skepticism. It's more of a very brief review of some of the basic traditional skeptical arguments. And those arguments go to the heart of knowledge. Now, he does mention Descartes, and he mentions Descartes kind of critically. Um, he, this is really at the beginning. He says there's a species of skepticism, this is on page 131, antecedent before all study in philosophy, which is much inculcated by Descartes and others as a sovereign preservative against error and precipitate judgment. It recommends an universal doubt. And Hume pretty much dismisses the usefulness of Cartesian doubt. Right? Remember, Cartesius, or Descartes, thought that he could rebuild his knowledge on sure foundations by subjecting every one of his beliefs to doubt and putting aside any that were doubtable or dubitable, so that if there was anything left over, it would be sure and certain and can serve as a foundation, a starting point for reliable knowledge. Hume has a couple of interesting things to say about that. First of all, there is no such principle. I don't know his basis for saying that, but he dismisses the idea of such an original principle. Remember what Descartes thought that principle was. I think I am, and I think therefore I am. So Hume doesn't really give us reasons to think that there isn't such a principle or there's something wrong with it. He also says something quite interesting, something that really came up in class, where he says, or if there were, that is, if there were such an original principle, could we advance a step beyond it? But by the use of those very faculties, we are supposed to be already diffident. That is, that it doesn't really get us anywhere. I think, therefore I am, because to move beyond it, as Descartes does in the Discourse on Method, you have to use the very faculties that you're doubting. I think Daniel in class said that the I think, therefore I am might be a dead end, and I think that's kind of what Hume is saying. But Hume doesn't think that skepticism is useless. As he says, in section 4 here, he seems to be reviewing the method, which is Descartes' method, and saying it might actually be pretty good. But his real target here is what he calls here, there's another species of skepticism consequent after science and inquiry. And that is the more traditional skepticism. You see, Descartes used skepticism as a tool. Descartes wanted to arrive, and did arrive, at least by his own lights, at a place where he thought he had knowledge, and sure knowledge. Whereas a traditional skeptic, academic philosopher, doesn't do that. That is, to be a skeptic is to say that there is no basis for knowledge, that there is no sure way of saying that we know anything. So Descartes used skepticism, but he wasn't a skeptic at the end of the day. It was kind of an instrumental skepticism. And the skepticism that Hume then outlines is a skepticism both about, in section 1, about our knowledge of the external world, and then in section 2, all other forms of knowledge. That is, the skeptic seeks to show that none of it makes any sense. Our basic claims about the external world are based entirely on a faith that such a world exists. what he calls, Hume here in section 7, men are carried by natural instinct or prepossession, prejudice, to repose faith in their senses. That is, we have a natural instinct to say that our senses lead to truth, meaning that our senses put us in touch with objects external to ourselves, that without any reasoning, or even almost before the use of reason, we always suppose an external universe which depends not on our perception, but would exist, though we and every sensible creature were absent or annihilated. That is, that there's an external world. It is composed of objects which are independent of us and our perceptions of them, and it would exist even if we were not perceiving them. That's the what he calls then in section 8 the blind and powerful instinct of nature. But he thinks that that's pretty easily dismissed, that, or he can pretty easily show that that blind and powerful instinct is not based on anything. And he has this wonderful, simple proof of it. And he says, look at a table and then move around the table. What you see is what I think it was Liz in class said, well, yeah, your perspective on it changes. She was quite right. I mean, that was a really good example. Well, yeah, you would, if you moved around a table and your image of the table remained the same, that would be really weird, because your perspective on the table should change, which is absolutely correct. I don't think it destroys Hume's point, which is that if you move around the table, your image of the table will change. If you move farther away, it'll get smaller. If you move closer, it'll get bigger. What does that tell you? It tells you that what you're perceiving is an image of the table, not the table itself. That is, it tells you that there must be a distinction between what you actually see and what might be there. Because we don't have the idea that the table will change, get larger or smaller when we move around it. What's getting larger or smaller is the image on our retinas, I guess. And what does it say? I mean, it tells you right away that you do not have a direct, immediate knowledge or perception of physical objects. At best, you can say that you perceive them through your own senses, but what you perceive directly are your own senses. And Hume thinks that this is pretty definitive. That is, this pretty much shows that we don't have any real knowledge of an external world, that it is a... Bertrand Russell, the 20th century philosopher, said, well, what we perceive, Hume is right, what we perceive directly are our own sense data, images, other sensations. And on the basis of those, we infer that there must be an object that causes them. But that is just an inference. And that inference could never actually be proved true. So for Hume, skepticism wins, and philosophically wins. And parts 2 and 3, what he has are pretty amazing, a pretty amazing commentary on that. And that is that skepticism philosophically does win. That is, it's the best argument. It shows that the kind of knowledge that we think we get through reason and sensation is unjustified. The claims that we get knowledge through those media are unjustified and philosophically unanswerable. You'll never be able to refute the arguments of the skeptic. But what is quite clear is that it doesn't really bother us that much. That is, that if there's any refutation of skepticism, it's that we live our lives and that we don't really worry about it. And that skeptical philosophy is kind of sterile, meaning it doesn't go anywhere. This is on page 139, at the bottom. He says, for here is the chief and most confounding objection to excessive skepticism, that no durable good can ever result from it, while it remains in its full force and vigor. We need only ask such a skeptic, what is his meaning? What his meaning is? Like, what's your purpose? What's your point? What are you trying to do? And what he proposes by all these curious researches, he is immediately at a loss and knows not what to answer. But as you have arguments about the impossibility of knowledge, let's say, or at least how our claims to knowledge lead to absurdities and contradictions. But what are you giving us, in terms of something practical. Um, and Hume claims the skeptic, or at least the excessive skeptic, has nothing to say. He continues, a Copernican or a Ptolemaic, that is, astronomers, who supports each his different system of astronomy, may hope to produce a conviction which will remain constant and durable with his audience. A Stoic or Epicurean displays principles which may not be durable, but which have an effect on conduct and behavior. But a Pyrrhonian, that is, a radical skeptic, cannot expect that his philosophy will have any constant influence on the mind. That is, you may prove to me, and I may accept logically, that I have no basis for my belief that there's an external world, but it's not going to influence the way that I live or even the way I think. I'm still going to jump out of the way of the dog or the bus. I'm still going to believe that um, my calculations in basic arithmetic are correct. Uh, so he continues, or if it had, that if it did have an influence in the mind, that its influence would be beneficial to society. It wouldn't be beneficial to society. On the contrary, he, the skeptic, must acknowledge, if he will acknowledge anything, that all human life must perish were his principles universally and steadily to prevail. All discourse, all action would immediately cease, and men remain in a total lethargy till the necessities of nature, unsatisfied, put an end to their miserable existence. It is true. So fatal an event is very little to be dreaded. Nature is always too strong for principle. That's such a good way of putting it. So skepticism, philosophically, as he says somewhere, is very strong, but practically or naturally very weak. Um, in the third section, where he seeks to show that, isn't this the section where he, uh, that a mitigated skepticism, a more moderate skepticism, would actually be, is actually quite useful in the sense that it uh, it dissuades us from being dogmatists. Uh, and then he goes on to his famous ending here, committed then to the flames, the idea that, well, it's really his attack on metaphysics, his idea that there's two sources. We can't be completely sure that they give us truth, but they're definitely the best we have, and those are abstract reasoning concerning number and quantity, which is basically mathematics and logic, and experimental reasoning on facts, things based on the senses. That philosophically, the skeptics show that neither of these have any foundation, but when it comes to actual thinking, they're the only even faintly reliable ways of seeking truth, and all other ways, as he says at the end, he's really thinking of metaphysics, are sophistry and delusion.